He is former minister of the reform of the state in Venezuela. And he has written about Venezuela, Chavismo, Hugo Chávez, and the situation in Venezuela. Carlos, can you tell us a little bit about what your work and efforts have been lately?
Thank you, Randy, for having me here in your program. Well, I have been working many years along with the democratic forces in Venezuela to try to get back freedom and democracy in our country. It has been a tough endeavor because there is like a quarter of a century with an authoritarian regime in the country between Chavez and now Maduro. So I work on that. And I also, as you said, I write op-eds, articles, essays. And recently, last year, I published a novel uh, not about Venezuela, but with Venezuelan background, how political power, uh, is, when it has no restrictions, leads to authoritarianism and dictatorship. And also, I work in the international realm as a consultant. Until recent years, I have been working with the Inter-American Development Bank in Colombia, with a unity of what we call a unidad of management in the presidency of Colombia.
How confident can we be that elections are a valid process? And so, what we hear some news of the candidacy within the opposition. The opposition world is one thing. What's happening there, and how can it affect any potential change in Venezuela?
Well, when Chavez won the election in 1998, was a fair election. He was a very popular guy. People preferred him for about 57% of the votes, of the electoral votes, and he was a legitimate elected president. Then, through the years, inspired in the Cuban Revolution and being one of the guys that tried to get rid of imperialism, meaning the United States, strength in the world. He became progressively an authoritarian leader, and in doing so, began to repress the opposition, to send to jail, to exile many leaders. Even in the streets, protests were badly repressed, with hundreds of people dead, mostly of them young people, students. And that path led to a very, very authoritarian regime in which, not surprisingly, we have elections, but rigged elections. Elections to say to the international community, well, we are a working democracy because we have elections, but almost most of the elections have been rigged. So the situation right now is that Venezuela is a devastated country. Before going into the electoral situation for this year and for next year, I would like to show you some figures about what is the real situation in Venezuela. Randy, please let me share this screen. Where you see here is Venezuelan GDP from the late 1990s to 2022. As you see, we had a peak around 2008 and 2011, and then Venezuela has been decreasing its GDP steadily until the 2020s, as we can see in this graph. And also, if we see how Venezuela is behaving according to the rule of law index, we see that overall index score, Venezuela is the last one, is the 140 country within 140 countries. According to constraints on government powers, you see, Venezuela is again the last one, being the first one, Denmark, and you see other countries, here, Guyana, or other countries that you can see there. In terms of absence of corruption, I have here absence of corruption. Venezuela is 130 in the post 130 amongst 140. Just better than Kenya, Madagascar, Uganda, Mexico, Bolivia, Haiti, Gabon, Cameroon, Cambodia, and Congo. About open, let's say, civil justice, Venezuela is 139 among 140 countries, and so on. So if we see, I have some, I'm not going to give too much data about this, but about a quarter of the Venezuelan population is outside the country, has fled in these recent years 7.2 million people from about 32 million people, that is Venezuelan population. We also had, I know you have some figures on that. We can take out this.
I'm just going to add one slide to yours.
Please.
This is an incredible slide. This is a logarithmic scale on the left. This is inflation, and so over here, this is an inflation index, and it's I'm not even sure how to evaluate this. What is it? I don't know, 100,000% or something like that.
Yeah,
enormous. I mean, it's an unfathomable inflation here. And this is also an interesting graph because it shows the different regimes. Maduro is over here in black, maybe appropriately, and Hugo Chávez is also quite appropriate in red. This line here. So you see Chávez, and there are some previous leaders. And so I don't think things were great here in the 80s. 10% inflation, not great. But I'm not sure what has happened here in 1980, so forth. But this is again, I emphasize, it's a logarithmic scale. So each kind of gradation here is 10 times worse than the previous. So you go from 10 to 100% to 1,000 to 10,000%. This is in 2012 over here. This is the change over time. The kind of the end of the Chavez regime, and so forth. I guess inflation has gotten somewhat better, but it's still in the 80% range and so forth. Maybe you can comment on some of this and some of the stresses this provides on society.
Yeah, I have some other figures here regarding to inflation, but before I want to say that between 2012 and 2022, in 10 years, the GDP, the Venezuelan GDP, decreased in 75% in 10 years. The accumulating inflation between 2015 and 2022 was please sit in your seat, quiet. 8.5 millions of millions percent. Just in 2018, the inflation of that year was 65,444.7%, almost 66,000% in 1 year. Meaning, that Venezuelan currency is not worth even for a souvenir.
Yeah.
Is just a mess. And the impact of this in the population
Yeah.
is that in 2022, 82% of Venezuelan population lived under poverty measured by income, and 53.3% in extreme poverty.
Yeah,
So
this slide I'm showing here is from Wikipedia. It's people eating from trash on the streets of
yeah,
Venezuela.
it's pretty sad because the people who suffers most are children and senior citizens. Because many young people have left the country to other countries. They come to the United States, especially to Florida, to Mexico, to Colombia. 2 million people, more than 2 million people in Colombia. 1.5 million Venezuelans just in Lima, the capital city of Peru. So is the worst humanitarian crisis, along with Syria and now Ukraine.
Yeah.
And there is a situation that is in which there is not an open war like in those countries, in a situation of people think,
Yeah. No.
peaceful.
And the incredible thing is that it wasn't always that way. I have this slide I'm just going to show. This is 1950, which may seem like a long time ago, but even into the 1960s, here's Venezuela. This is the top GDPs in the world.
Yeah, and
United States,
Venezuela was in the
Switzerland, New
top
Zealand,
five.
Venezuela. So this is the wealthiest country in Latin America, and I believe in 1965 still remained the wealthiest country in Latin America, and it's blessed with natural oil reserves, and kind of a spigot for cash, not unlike Saudi Arabia and UAE. They've managed to keep their spigots running and flowing. And I'm not saying they have great regimes over there uniformly, but the people are wealthy at the very least. They don't
Yeah,
have financial concerns.
and what is pretty sad is that Venezuela is in a very privileged location
Hmm.
in the Americas. It's close to the United States. 2.5 hours from Miami, flying from Caracas. Is a center of the Caribbean, and is also the door to the Andean countries, with which Venezuela is very, very close related. Venezuela has the most important oil reserves in the world, and is a country that has gold, diamonds, coltan, a lot of minerals. And now that blessing is a curse. Why? Because those minerals, for instance, in the south of Venezuela, are taken by the Colombian guerrillas, the drug traffickers, and some of the high ranking military officers that lead the country. That's the real situation in Venezuela.
So I'd like to maybe add to that, and obviously you're more knowledgeable, but it takes an incredible act of malfeasance to take the largest exporter of oil in the Americas, and basically a money spigot akin to the Saudis, and turn that into dust. I mean, how does one take an apparatus such as that and have it not make money for the country at the very least? I mean, how do you become impoverished and have to print cash when you basically can drill cash out of the ground and sell it right at port?
Venezuela produced at one time 3.5 million of oil barrels per day, and now is producing like 700,000. It has decreased almost to a quarter of what was the production. Why happened this? There are many causes. The first one and the fundamental one is that Chavez tried to achieve what he called a socialist revolution, where the investors, the foreign investors and the national investors became the enemies. The rich were the enemies, and they were subservient to the imperialism, meaning to Washington and to the interest of capitalism. And that idea that he had to take down the economic system and its agents led to a country in which the oil industry, instead of continue producing more and calling foreign capital to invest in oil and other sources of energy in Venezuela, they took that coffer of resources to give to as handouts to other countries, to promote revolution in Latin America, to other to candidates like Evo Morales in Bolivia, like Ortega in Nicaragua, like Fidel Castro, and later Raúl, and later on Díaz-Canel, and to other political movements in Latin America. So instead of having a strong oil industry investing in other sources of energy and increasing its production that was going to be 5 million barrels per day, well, the oil industry began to be depleted, thrown in decay, and there was no resources anymore in as it used to have.
So
and later on, let me tell you this. Well, they began to give handouts to people, because if there is no investment, there is no employment, and not having employment, the poverty increased, and they thought they could fulfill people's need with this kind of handouts, until a moment in which the country didn't have resources, and they began the traditional tool to use the traditional tool, which is printing money.
Yeah, it's always kind of the last refuge of a scoundrel. Mugabe, one thinks of, and I just wanted to put a quick slide of the declining, the recently declining. This is kind of a large time frame here, so it goes all the way back to 1940 on the left. But if we just kind of look at the modern era here, here's 2000 over here. So Chavez came in power, and oil hung around for a little bit, and then it reached this kind of steep decline in the mid 2010s. But my question, I have my understanding is there was also an aspect of kind of what we saw maybe in Cambodia and during the Cultural Revolution in China, kind of this Maoist purging of the intellectuals and so forth. And in Chavez's kind of anti-imperialist strain, I read years ago, I didn't pull it up for today, that he basically got rid of the foreign engineers and so forth, and replaced a lot of the mid-level technical jobs with his friends and cronies, and made these political appointees. And political, you might know a lot about I don't know, Mao's Red Book, but not very much about how to fix the dials and widgets, kind of like having Homer Simpson run the nuclear power plant. This is not really a recipe. And so a lot of things just got into disrepair, physically and organizationally. Are you familiar with that aspect at all?
Which one specifically?
Well, that in the oil infrastructure, that there was a removal of foreign engineers and corporate engineers, and a replacement by party apparatchiks to run an industry. And they might be able to run a ministry, but to run an industry is an entirely different thing when you actually have to have product.
The issue is that, let me put this slide that you have there. I don't know if you have of oil production. Can you see
want the
it?
slide back up?
Did you see it? No, not
your slide or my slide?
Mine.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yep.
No, what is not that one. But in any case, I was trying to show oil production in Venezuela.
Well, that's what this one is here. This slide is
that one.
This one is oil production in Venezuela, and I'll zoom out. This is,
okay.
The South American nation is far away from reaching the 3 million barrels produced in 1998. We're down here or someplace.
Yeah.
This is in 2021. So this is a steep, precipitous drop, which is hard to show in this particular image. But we're looking. This is around 2012 or something like that. The last 10 years, boom, this is where we are. It's dropped off a cliff.
Yeah, but what happened with the oil industry was that with no investment, with trying to repress oil industry managers that were very, very well trained Venezuelan technicians, Venezuelan managers in the oil industry. They began to go to other countries, and there are a lot of Venezuelans experts in the oil industry, working in Canada, in the Middle East, and in other oil countries in the world. And of course, once Chavez retired from the oil industry, half of the employees, 20,000 people, were fired. In a span of a month, or like that, or something like that, because they were supportive of the protest against the regime. So all the high-ranking staff of the Venezuelan oil industry disappeared, and began the industry to be managed, by people that not knowledgeable to the business. So that meant the decrease that you already showed. Well, the situation now is that Venezuela is where we have described in this talk, and the opposition in Venezuela has tried many times to get strength to get rid of the regime through elections, through protest, um, having international support from the international community, having an interim president. That's the we having many tries in this process. Nowadays, we are in the path of a presidential election next year in 2024. We don't know when it's going to be held. We don't know if it's going to happen, because in the constitution that they have, that the country has, was the constitution of Chavez, says that in next year, 2024, should be held a presidential election. But they managed to change the dates and what's going to happen at will. But we are preparing in Venezuela to that election. And for going to that election, the opposition has in October 2023 a primary to select the presidential candidate. In that competition are 14 candidates, but the leading one is Maria Corina Machado by far. She has more than, in many polls, more than 50% of popular support of the people going to the primary. And the issue that happened recently is that officially the the general controller of Venezuela disqualified her for 15 years from public offices. It's incredible. But for this primary, that doesn't have anything to do, because it's an election within the democratic forces. Is not for a public post, but is what the government is saying is that this woman cannot run next year, trying to make people think, well, if she's not running next year, why would we vote for her in the primary? But what has happened is, because of the disqualifying process, more people are engaging in the primary and are supporting her. That's one thing. But the other new thing that is happening these days is that the regime is trying to halt the primary through a resolution, a decision of the Supreme Court. Someone has asked the Supreme Court to suppress that primary on regards that there are disqualified people participated, that there some candidates that were not accepted, arguments to try to smash the primary. These days are decisive for that decision. I think that if the government goes by this route seems to be very, very close or similar to Nicaragua, in which Ortega and his wife, the Vice President Murillo, got put in jail all the candidates of the opposition, exiled all the leaders of the political parties, and controlled the country in a very tough and repressive way.
So let me ask you a question, because you were the minister of reform of the government. I'm not sure under which regime or time frame that was in Venezuela. Um, so there's reform, and then there's revolution, and there's destruction. I'm not sure what terminology. I'm curious, given your knowledge of governmental processes, what was the tweak? What was the pivot? What was the turn? What was the way of sabotaging Venezuela's constitution and or form of government that happened? And how were the Venezuelans led down this kind of primrose path to have a functioning, say, constitutional government? I'm assuming. Maybe you can tell us maybe fill us in a little bit on the format of Venezuela's type of government pre-Chavez, and then how did he actually take those mechanisms and have it work against itself? Was it electoral? I read in one of, I think, his re-election, or one of these assembly elections, he got only 51% of the popular vote, but he somehow took 95% of the delegates. This is around 2001 or something like that. I've checked the time frame. What was that? How did that happen? Was that electoral fraud, or was that finding a weakness in the form of the Constitution? How did he dissolve the Senate and form a unicameral body?
The process,
because I'm interested. What are the preventions that a government can have on being hijacked?
Well, that's a process that is not new in Latin America. It also happened recently in Bolivia, this recent years, and Bukele in El Salvador is trying to do that, and other presidents, which is, to call a constitutional assembly, a constituent assembly, meaning an assembly that can modify, change, or create a new constitution. And what happened with Chavez was that assembly was called, elected in 1999, when happened that with the 60% of the votes, they got more than 90% of the representation. In that case, not due to electoral fraud, but to the managing the system to get that. A disproportionate representation. And what happened was that Constituent Assembly said, we have all the powers of the state because we represent the people. And with that vision of its power, that assembly suppressed the parliament and appointed a group of people that were going to fulfill the role of the Congress, suppressed the Supreme Court, and appointed a group of justices as members of the Supreme Court. And as in doing that, Chavez began to control the executive power, legislative power, and judicial power at the same time. And controlling all the powers, he began, this path to authoritarianism, recovered by, constitutional and legal forms. It's not that I am suppressing the Electoral Council, for instance, is that the Congress and the judiciary are doing that. And that's what, what is happening until now. Chavez and later Maduro are not doing anything outside of the law because they control the ones who control the application of the law. So everything is approved by the National Assembly controlled by them or the judiciary controlled by them. So seems to be that everything is legal, as Fidel Castro used to say about Cuba. Well, we are a very good working democracy. We have elections, we have a national assembly, we have the judiciary branch working. So what are you protesting about? So that's the situation. Because in the rationale of this, it seems to be a crazy situation for people uh, formed and educated under a culture of democracy, the rule of law, etc. But the rationale of this situation is that they are fighting against an international enemy, and all the measures that have to be taken inside is to prepare when the enemy invades the country through its troops or through other means. And that's the idea. We have a blockade, we have a embargo, we have to fight against it, and they put the causes in the place of the consequences, and vice versa, because there are sanctions, but the sanctions that we have now in Venezuela are because there are some causes creating the necessity of those sanctions. So, is there an opportunity to get rid of this regime by electoral means? That's a question that many people ask. And we can say, what I can say in this regard is that if you have a strong uh, national movement for democracy, if you get a constitutional role of the military and get the support of the international community, in the Venezuelan case, meaning mainly from the United States, Spain, and some Latin American countries, we can have the strength, enough strength, to oblige Maduro to accept the result of an election in which he is going to lose, according to the polls, to the polls that we have right now. Maduro has less than 25% of support, which is not, minor support, but most of the people are wanting to get rid of him.
So, can we? I'd like to, you brought up a lot of interesting topics there. I'd like to maybe talk about sanctions, the kind of the whether that's been potent or effective in changing things in Venezuela. Moreover, how do those sanctions differ under the Biden administration versus the Trump? What was Venezuela's reaction to the Trump sanctions? What's their reaction to him now? A, and B, what happened during the Trump era with the 2019 uprising? And just as a refresher for our viewers, there was a 2019 Venezuelan uprising attempt involving, let's see, how do you pronounce his name? Juan Guaido. And what's happening with him now? Is he part of the opposition still? And did he manage to live through this?
Well, about Juan Guaido, he was an interim president of the opposition because he was the president of the legitimate National Assembly elected in 2015. And as president of that assembly, the Venezuelan Congress, there was a movement supported by the international community, according to which he could take office because the international community and many, people's democratic parties in Venezuela said that the election of Maduro in 2018 was a fraud, that Maduro was not a legitimate president. And so Guaido, as president of the National Assembly, took office. That was a period in which people thought that we had the strength to go from this interim presidency to a transition process to fair and free elections, and then to democracy again. That period of four years ended in December 2022, when Guaido was, you know, some of the parties that supported him retreat from that support, and the interim presidency was over. That happened in a span of 4 years. There was an uprising, a military uprising in 2019. In the situation in which Guaido was president. Guaido became president, interim president, in January 2019, and this military coup attempt was in April 30th. That was a kind of adventure that has nothing to do with the democratic process that Venezuela needed at that moment. But besides that, what has been happening is that the interim government ended last year, and then now we are trying to get these forces together, the international community, the institutional role of the military, and the citizens movement inside Venezuela. What is going to happen? We don't know, because we can create momentum to a negotiation in which Maduro understands that he cannot continue leading the country in such a way, and he had to allow free and fair elections. That would be the desirable outcome for Venezuela. Regarding to U.S. policy, sanctions began at the end of Obama government. They were increased in Trump's government, and then in the Biden government, most of the sanctions continue, but some of them have been lifted. What we see during Trump and Biden administration is that Democrats and Republicans, they in the Congress, they support Venezuelan democratic forces. That's something that is a bipartisan support that has been, going on since some years ago. But from the administration, what I see is that has become erratic, not very firm, because at the same time that the sanctions are still there, and there is a process in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, there are some softening of those sanctions in some specific cases. And what I see is that there is no a clear comprehension of what Venezuelan means for Latin America. If you want to stop this huge migration to other countries, including the United States, if you have to tackle the drug trafficking process, if you need to combat ELN and FARC guerrillas and the Mexican cartels that are operating in Venezuela, if you want to stop the influence of Iran and Hezbollah in Venezuela, well, you have to support the return to democracy in the country. And I think that's not clear. I recommend a wonderful article of Elliot Abrams. He was the special envoy to Venezuela, or for Venezuela in Trump's administration. And nowadays, some people are saying that he could be appointed again as a person with bipartisan support for Venezuela in Washington. But he had written a wonderful op-ed recently that is very critique on Washington policies towards Latin America and Venezuela.
No, I agree. And so people can find that article at the CFR, Council for Foreign Relations page. I can put a link up later. I also found this article interesting. There's an expression, when you're getting flack, you're over the target. So when people are firing at you, you are obviously have done something to irritate. So the kind of the contradistinction between the Biden and Trump regimes, I think, could be exemplified here. The National Assembly, the AN, elected in 2020, investigates alleged criminal responsibility of Trump for applying sanctions on Venezuela. So Pedro Infante accused the opposition. I assume he's accusing some of the Venezuelan opposition of treason, and opined that those who have promoted sanctions, I guess from within Venezuela, should receive sentences of up to 30 years. I don't think he can sentence Donald Trump. I think the Biden administration is too interested in doing that themselves. But here they've got a commission. I'm not sure who Mr. Infante is.
He's a member of the National Assembly controlled by the government.
Yeah, so it's an overwhelming Chavista majority, which I guess kind of, so they want criminal responsibility for Donald Trump. I'm not sure how that's criminal if Donald Trump, is a duly elected official. He's doing American policy. I'm not sure how that's criminal in the Venezuelan context, but certainly they can get the people in Venezuela.
They from time to time they accuse people of being agents of Washington,
right,
or traditionally of the CIA. Also, people working for the military invasion, for sanctions, economic and financial sanctions, and that, according to them, mean all those measures mean that the promoters should be treated as traitors and should be imprisoned. That's the way in which the tale goes, saying from time to time, and they get some people when they need it. But this is a speech that goes over and over, creating an environment in which Venezuelans who protest outside, abroad, are traitors. And if you understand what is happening in Venezuela, that includes that you don't have free media. Almost most of the media networks are controlled by the government, and those who are still in private hands are submitted to the control of the government. For instance, Maria Corina Machado cannot be interviewed in most of these radio or TV stations in Venezuela. It's prohibited to interview her.
Are they allowed to replay it? I mean, I noticed she was on what channel was it? TVV, which is, I guess, is in Miami. Here's an interview.
Yeah, that's, I think, in Miami. Yes, and that's
TVV
Maria Corina.
Noticias. My useless disqualification is a mistake by the regime since it has given the citizen struggle a new dimension. We go ahead with everything until the end. That's our English translation. Maria Corina Machado with Gladys Rodriguez.
Yes, that's her motto, saying until the end. Until the end, until the end is freedom, is liberties for all, and democracy. Well, Randy.
All right, so we're rounding out the hour here. I don't want to take too much of your time. I do want to show people your books, and there's two actually alternate covers of your book, Revolución y Desilusión, La Venezuela de Hugo Chávez, and there's one cover here, and I assume this is the same book.
Yeah, but this is in Kindle.
Oh, I see. Fair enough. So people can buy it on Amazon, and here you are in the upper corner. And there's also your other book here.
My novel.
Yes. And so I haven't read it yet. My Spanish is adequate, but not. I don't think it's up to the task. I did translate the gist of this here, but maybe you can describe the English title. What is the essence of your book and the novel?
How will you translate the title?
The Grand March to the Abyss, right?
Yes. That's it.
Yeah. So, I think I don't want to go too far into that, but I think you novelize kind of a Stalin-like figure, and I assume it's got Latin American tinges. I just read a book called Campus Land, which is a fabulous book. It's a Tom Wolfe, A Bonfire of the Vanities like book, but takes place on an American campus, and so it's a shadow book. It's a satire, and yours is probably darker than that because I mean, I suppose there's comedy and tragedy. They somewhat meet. Tell us a little bit the essence of your book and what were your thoughts in making it as we round out the hour here, just in maybe a couple minutes.
My book is about those revolutionaries that fight, from the dark, trying to get the revolution done, to seize power, as a guerrilla fighters, as organizers of people underground, and when they get to office, they become monsters. They become everything that they said they were combating against, and that's the transformation of those leaders and militants in horror figures. What I think you're going to find in that book. I'm going to translate it, by the way. I hope, and in the next program we can talk about.
I'm going to read from this review. Although populism is simultaneously tragedy, farce, and sacramental, which gives it enormous literary fertility, evil always is. Carlos Blancos's Gran Marcha hacia el Abismo is one of the works that fictionalize populism. in this Venezuelan case, achieving a magnificent work, without a doubt, a precursor of a new literary genre that's already prefigured as the populesque. I'm not sure there's a great translation, but I think there's a lot here. Populism has a great word. I mean, it starts with the people. And so what's wrong with that? I mean, it's like a lot of things that sound good.
Starts with the people and ends with the people too.
Right. So I don't know if you're familiar with H.L. Mencken, who was kind of like the successor to Mark Twain, early 20th century American author and journalist. And he wrote, democracy is the principle by which the people vote to get what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. So that's a kind of a cynical view of the kind of the way that there can be a tyranny of the majority and take democracy away from its natural, say, populist roots and have it misused. And, so I like to point out that, we have a constitutional republic with democracy, and without the Constitution, without a framework, democracy can devolve. And so what you have in essentially Chavismo is they took away the constitutional part and they wind up with their pseudo democracy, but then it depends on how you count the people. And, democracy can also be, defined as three wolves and a sheep, just, voting on what's for dinner. And it tends to be the sheep. And in this case, the wolves are probably out, they're overvoted. And the sheep, the people, are underrepresented, and they wind up being the fuel for kind of a vicious predatory regime. That's at least the way I look at it. But, final words before I kind of give my shameless self-promotion about my book.
Well, thank you, Randy. I think we have to show how Venezuela has evolved from a working democracy for 40 years after the previous dictatorship that ended in 1958 to this regime led by Chávez in 1999. Was a democracy, was a working democracy, but it failed in reformed itself when it was needed. The political system got, engaged in problems. The political parties didn't renew their ideology, their working process. They took democracy for granted, and it was not.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. Ben Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. So we have to remain eternally vigilant, and hopefully we'll find the fractures and fissures within our own regime that, present possibilities and kind of holes in which certain, animals can burrow and try to invade and subvert the system. So I'm going to end with a picture of my book here. This is Overturning Zika. Fortunately, has a portrait of me on the cover. So this is Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. And people may already forget about Zika microcephaly, the dengue virus that was ostensibly causing small-headed baby births, microcephaly, in mothers in Brazil in 2015-16. It was the largest medical news item in 2016. It's somewhat disappeared from view since then. So I recommend people try to at least support the podcast by buying this. Hopefully they read it. Give me